All right, let us now start committing some philosophy of biology. But before we jump right in, we are nearing the end of the semester, which is when I tend to sermonize a little bit because I want to try to make a difference to how your education goes, and hopefully your education does not end even if you are graduating seniors. So I'm going to take this occasion to talk a little bit about methodology. You should think about what kinds of intellectual progress you make and don't make in your courses. And here's one framework for approaching some of these questions. Generally, we have a picture where you make intellectual progress via addition. There was something relevant that you failed to know, and so the ignorance gets fixed when you are told relevant stuff. But often, intellectual progress proceeds via subtraction, when you are freed from confusions or from misinformation. So in this course, for most people anyway, you didn't know much about quantum, which is a little odd because that news is more than 100 years old, at least the beginnings of quantum theory. But nevertheless, most people are ignorant about quantum mechanics, and so the way for them to make intellectual progress is to learn true and relevant facts about it. A more complicated example is our historical centerpiece, the revolution from really Ptolemy to Newton, but the details cover the Copernicus to Newton part of that revolution. So there's some addition. You maybe didn't know much about Kepler, for instance, or Galileo's physics combined with his astronomy. But what's most important in understanding that revolution really is a matter of subtraction, because most people are in the grip of a bad theory, according to which Copernicus just came along and recognized the clear simplicity and accuracy of a view that has everything moving around the sun rather than the earth. Hopefully you know by now that that ain't so, right? Copernicus was, if anything, more Aristotelian than Ptolemy, and his view was not simpler, nor was it more accurate until, after 1600, telescopic evidence gets added to the picture. Why am I inflicting this on you? Well, it helps you get ready for the final exam, perhaps, but more pointedly, you should think about what you know and what you think you know about evolution as we go into these last three lectures, last three equivalents of course meetings. See what gets added to your knowledge about evolution, and for most people, some stuff will be added, but also see what confusions you may be in the grip of about what evolution is and how it works. The way we hope it goes is these two kinds of progress combine and mutually reinforce each other. Right? So hopefully you now know enough stuff about Einstein to recognize why it's wrong to read the theory of relativity as saying it's all relative. That's just not true. It's central to Einstein's view that things like the Minkowski space-time interval and the velocity of light are not relative to anything about the observer. So we add some things to your picture of the world that simultaneously subtract confusions and mistaken beliefs. Ideally, those things solidify one another and you come out with something lasting, something that you can take beyond the final exam, which again is where I'm going with these sorts of sermons. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the concept of evolution. One thing to note is that term might mean less than you thought it did. It is not an inherently biological notion. It involves changes in the characteristics of populations across generations. That's kind of a slogan. We need to unpack it. But there is no conceptual restriction to biological entities. We're really only going to talk about evolution in the biological realm. But genuine evolution can happen about things that are not living things. The notion of life, by the way, is a fascinating conceptual challenge to draw lines between things like viruses, computer viruses, various hard cases about things that are not obviously living nor obviously not living, but that's above our pay grade in a 100 level course. So the concept of evolution is not a biological concept. It requires variation in traits, typically thought of in terms of generations, variations that can be passed along, that can be inherited. and it requires some selection mechanism, some selection process, some way in which selection operates on the traits that get passed on from one generation to another. DeWitt usually calls this differential fitness. So it is true, or at least it can be true, that things like cell phones evolve. When people talk about the next generation of a cell phone, they need not be speaking metaphorically. Because you can talk about traits that either are or aren't passed on from the previous generation, and there is selection on those traits. If people like the home button, then it tends to persist. If they don't, it tends to disappear, etc. Not every kind of change is evolutionary change, right? Erosion, for instance, is change over time, but it's not generational change. There aren't traits that are passed on from one individual to another. So I think it's quite true that evolution can apply to things that are not living things, but you do have to beware some conceptual confusions. If you watch too many ads for cell phones, they would suggest that cell phone evolution involves progress, that as you go from one generation to another, the cell phones get better. Maybe, but there's nothing about evolution that says things always get better, right? You might miss the home button on previous versions of the iPhone, and especially in this era of masks, you might not like facial recognition being the way you get into your phone. So that's a later generation, but it doesn't follow from it being a later generation that there has been progress. A bunch of you talk this way about science, that everything in science involves progress. I hope it's clear by now that it's very plausible that science makes progress over time, but it's very implausible that every step in science involves progress. And it's not even clear how to measure progress, right? In some ways, Einstein goes back to a more Aristotelian conception of physics than Newton had, because Einstein requires a mechanism for something like gravity. Is Einstein progress with respect to Newton? I think most people would say yes, but it's not monotonic or continual progress. Science often giveth and it taketh away. Okay, now centering on evolution in nature, the biological sense of evolution, there will be something that is easy to confuse with progress, and DeWitt emphasizes this point. I want to emphasize it too, and a little bit differently than DeWitt does. Any kind of evolution, artificial selection or natural selection, will on average and in the long run favor traits that do well as judged by the selection mechanism. So if you're selecting for bulldogs with big heads, then by and large, on average and over time, later generations are going to have bigger heads. Is that progress? Well, it is, in a certain sense, progress as judged by the selection mechanism. But you gotta put that qualifier in there. It's getting harder and harder for bulldogs to be born naturally because their heads are too big, and the breed would go extinct if it weren't for intervention by humans. So is that progress? In a certain sense, right? If you're selecting for large heads, then you're getting progress towards bigger heads. Can you just call that progress, period? Almost certainly not. So when we substitute natural selection for artificial selection, it is true, and DeWitt's a little misleading about this, I think, that insofar as you keep the environment constant, that's a big if. Insofar as you keep the selection mechanism constant, that's a less big if, but still an if. We'll talk more about the details of that later. Then you can expect each generation to have more traits that are explained by having been selected for. So evolution will tend to lead to organisms that are increasingly well adapted to their environment, where well adapted means able to survive, and this only holds if the environment remains relevantly constant. So this is a very limited and qualified sense of better, right? Is it better for bulldogs to have big heads? Well, it depends. Are you talking about what will cause them to do well in a dog show, or what will cause them to be able to be born naturally? So don't confuse better according to a particular selection procedure with better overall. Going back to political primaries rather than the general election that we just had, political primaries select for candidates that appeal to that party's voters. That doesn't necessarily put the candidate in a good position to do well in a general election, right? So political primaries select for something, and there's a kind of success in terms of that selection procedure. But from the standpoint of winning a general election or governing, those selection procedures might well not lead to any kind of betterness. So DeWitt hammers home the point that evolution doesn't necessarily lead to betterness. I'm going to develop it in a little more detail than he does because I find his formulations a little too compressed to be clear and persuasive. So evolution does not simply produce better creatures over time. It is very difficult to be clear about what that means. If the environment stays the same and if you throw in some other hedges, evolution will tend to produce better adaptation to a given environment. But that's not just plain betterness, that's better according to a very specific selection procedure, and the hedges about the environment staying the same do a lot of work. Maybe this is a very modest kind of teleology, and DeWitt, I think, is a little simple-minded. He opposes mechanism and teleology. That goes way back to his discussion of Aristotle, where he contrasts mechanical causation with teleological causation. He leaves out material and formal, and even efficient causation isn't always mechanical. So I think DeWitt oversimplifies this issue. We've seen people like Leibniz insist that there are quasi-teleological principles in physics. When light takes a least action path, when energy tends to spread out and dissipate, those can be thought of in terms of a very modest kind of Aristotelian final cause. There are particular kinds of states that are brought about by natural processes. So, and we'll pursue this more next week as we get deeper into DeWitt on evolution. He seems to me a little sneaky when he tries to just simplify everything down to mechanistic or teleological explanation. But the basic point for today, I think he's right about, which is it does not so much as make sense to simply say that evolution produces better creatures over time. And insofar as it makes sense, it's not true. Mostly, it's not even clear what's being claimed. So that is a very widespread misunderstanding of what evolution is about. An additional mistake on top of that one that's made by lots and lots of people is to think that evolution has been trying to bring about us or something like us. Evolution is not trying to bring about anything. It tends to bring about certain things, and again, I think DeWitt should own that a little more than he does. But it's a process of trial and error with a ton of errors, but certainly not a conscious kind of trial and error. Random mutations introduce new possibilities. Most of those turn out to be either neutral or disastrous, and so they end up doing nothing. But that process will sometimes produce complexity, among other things, but it's not trying to produce complexity. It's not trying to produce survival. It's not the sort of thing that is in the trying business. DeWitt is quite right to insist that you do not adapt in order to survive. You survive because of adaptation. But there's a connection between the two, of course. Creatures that are well adapted will tend to survive. That doesn't mean you adapt in order to survive. I'll come back to that point at the end of a lecture on this chapter. Okay, going to clear up a couple more confusions and then give you a break before turning to part 2 of this lecture. DeWitt does not point out that evolution is highly constrained. It might be swell for blue whales to be able to fly. It might be very useful for them to get away from whalers. But they have a design plan such that wings cannot be introduced to that design plan. You can't get there from here, given their genetics, and the physics of a blue whale is not conducive to flight. So, this idea that evolution is always looking to make things better for every kind of creature in every way is just nuts. Not everything that's adaptive is attainable via something like evolution. There's no way to gradually change a population's characteristics such that you end up with those sorts of things. Finally, before we take a break, this idea that consciousness or sentience, which is the ability to feel pleasure or pain, or reasoning, that these are just good things, that we are better creatures than our fellow creatures on the planet, is a very vexing idea. I don't know that I would want to be conscious if I were a tree. I'd be aware of what's happening. I would not be able to do a damn thing about it, and I would likely be bored out of my mind. So, from the fact, assuming it is a fact, that conscious awareness or the ability to feel pleasure or pain, the ability to reason, those are arguably good things for creatures like us. It is a much larger additional step to think that those are just good things for anything to have. A rock would not want to be able to feel pleasure and pain because it gets kicked a lot. As I said, a tree might not enjoy being conscious or being able to reason because it would be ineffectual. We'll clear up one or two more confusions about evolutionary theory and then get into some details in the second part of our lecture on DeWitt's chapter 29. As always, thanks for your time and attention.